Hello and welcome. This is Matthias 76. Together, we are decoding the deception, and together, today, we're in the Gospel of John. I'm planning on, kind of really putting it out here, we're saying this, but I'm planning on getting through the second chapter of John today. So, going to jump right in, go ahead and get started, because there is a lot of ground that we want to cover. So we're here in John 2 with the wedding at Cana. And a couple things I want to throw out there, and I'll keep saying them because it's important for us to remember. These are things, I don't just put them out there because, these are the things I say when I'm teaching the Gospel of John. These are important things of which I remind myself as I'm reading the Gospel of John, as I'm studying and preparing to teach here. These are things I tell myself. The Gospel of John is the last gospel to be written, much later than all the others, but very importantly, and we're going to see one of these things in chapter 2 here today, John gives us insight into things that we would not have known otherwise. And I'll just throw out the teaser. If it weren't for the Gospel of John, we wouldn't have known that Jesus' ministry spanned 3 Passover festivals. We wouldn't have known that. And so that's very important for us in having the time frame of Jesus' ministry. Without the time frame of Jesus' ministry, we would have thought it was a year and a half or something like that. Without the time frame of John, rather, giving us that time frame, we would have thought that Jesus' ministry was only a year and a half or so. So let's jump in. We're going to do some geography, going to do some maps, fun stuff like that. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." There are a couple other really cool things here. Let's talk about the day thing first. On the third day, well, if you go back and look, it's going from, it says the next day, and then it calls this the third day. So from a timeline perspective, we know this is 3 days after John the Baptist pointed to him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So on the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. We'll talk about weddings more as we go, but let's talk about the mother of Jesus. There are things that are unique to the different gospel writers. John never calls Mary, Mary. He refers to her as the mother of Jesus. He does not refer to her as Mary. It's just interesting, and I don't know if there's anything profound in that. Maybe he is just drawing attention to the fact that she is his mother. And by using this description of her, that's more clearly set forth than calling her Mary. Don't know. So he was invited. His disciples were invited. And this is interesting. You know, how long had his disciples been his full-time disciples, and yet they were invited as well. But let's talk weddings. And weddings are a wonderful thing. Weddings are a joyous celebration. Anyone who has planned one or is planning one knows that weddings are a tremendous amount of work, and weddings are expensive. Just time-wise, right now, the cost with everything pertaining to weddings has just gone up and up and up. Won't talk about why, but it just has, much more so than the outlandish inflation we're experiencing other places. But in this culture, in this time, in this place, weddings were huge. Weddings were huge. They were far more culturally significant than they are today. Think of if you paid for the wedding for a child, or helped pay for a wedding, or paid for your own wedding. Imagine it going on 7 days. 7 days the celebration went on. And the family had to feed them all. And you had to have wine for them all. And we're not going to go into all the nuances of it. And I don't claim to be an expert. I just know the things I've read and studied. It was such a big deal that it could be a legal offense, like something you could bring someone to court over if they didn't bring a meaningful enough gift to the wedding. Correspondingly, there were great expectations on what was to be delivered to those who came and attended the wedding. Okay, so culturally, it was a huge deal. How it got there, the history of that, I don't know, but it was a really big deal. But that explanation frames the huge faux pas that was happening here. You didn't run out of wine at a wedding. It was a major offense, and it literally would have been the kind of thing that people in Cana in Galilee would have been talking about 20 years on. And any of you who've grown up in a small town, you know how people can get with, oh, do you remember so-and-so and such and such? And oh, wasn't that embarrassing? I pulled up the map here. This is the map that looks at Jesus' ministry. I'm trying to get it framed the right size for you here. Jesus' ministry up in Galilee. That's this region up here. All of this, all these lines are, this is Galilee. And right here, there are places that you hear the names of in the Gospels all the time. Bethsaida, Gergesa, the Gergesenes, the demoniac, possessed by a legion of demons, Capernaum, Chorazin, Tiberias, these different places. And then over here, you've got Nazareth. It's where Jesus of Nazareth. And up here, and this is kind of a guesstimate because we don't really know exactly where Cana was. It was a small little place, and we don't know exactly where it was, but it was somewhere in this region here. The reason I'm showing this, we're going to see in a moment when he heads down to Jerusalem how far it was. But just to put it in perspective, Capernaum, which is right here where the cursor is, zoom in a little bit, that is 80 miles from Jerusalem. A big part of Jesus' ministry went on out here in what they considered to be the sticks. So just wanted to geographically keep in mind where they are. Cana is only mentioned twice in the New Testament, both in the Gospel of John, and both times there's a miracle done there. We'll get to the other when we arrive there. So they went, and the wine ran out. The mother of Jesus, same way describing her again, said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." And his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." There is just this fascinating thing here. What did Mary know? And when did she know it? Right? Why did she go to him and do this? He had performed no miracles. And we have to be careful with this because we can just run mad with speculation and go all kinds of places that aren't warranted. But it's just interesting. Did she have the understanding that once he was, he had his baptism from John the Baptist and he was calling disciples that it was time? Don't know. But there's this interesting exchange. Woman, what does this have to do with me? Like, why are you telling me? My hour has not yet come. Well, his mom was telling him his hour apparently had come, but still, he does this miracle, as fantastic as it is. He does this miracle on the down low. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. She knew he'd go ahead and do it. Just kind of interesting. And all we can do is look at it and say, wow, that's fascinating. Now, there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. This is the first of the signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Okay, let's talk about some of the particulars. They were stone jars. Stone jars were used for these purification rites. They were considered to be pure. They wouldn't contaminate the water in any way. And the purification rites, that's about washing dishes, washing hands, all these different things that went on. But also, these things weren't right out in the center where everybody would see them. They were off to the side. So no one knew that Jesus was doing this except for the servants and no doubt the groom and the bride and their immediate families, who knew they were in a bad way because they had run out of wine. So fill the jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said, now take some out and give it to the master of the feast. That guy was probably, the equivalent of what today would be a banquet coordinator or a wedding coordinator. They've got positions like that, right? Important position. He was in charge. And so they took it. And when he drank it, he said, this is the best wine, this amazing thing that usually, and this is a given, right? You serve the good beer first and then the cheap stuff. You serve the good wine first and then the cheap stuff. Once people have been imbibing and their taste buds and their discernment as to the grade of the wine, the vintage kind of deteriorates, then you can pass off the stuff that doesn't come from a bottle with a cork but's got a screw top, right? But we can talk about all those details. Big point, though, Jesus kept this low key. Jesus kept it low key, and that's a theme throughout the miracles that Jesus performs. He never wants things to be a big deal. When he's raising a child from the dead, what does he do? He takes a few of the disciples in with him and the parents and tells everybody else to stay out. He does things quietly because he didn't want to be the guy everybody came to see because he did amazing stuff. That's going to happen anyway because you can't keep this stuff quiet. But he wanted to keep it quiet. Why else did he want to keep it quiet? Let's just think it through. Think of all the stuff I rambled on about at the beginning about the proprieties of the wedding ceremony and the week-long festival. It was humiliating for the family. Jesus saved them from that humiliation. If he'd put the spotlight on himself, he would have had to stand on top of them for his miracle to shine, and they would have been humiliated forever. He let them think that they just had this wine. It's just his way. It's just his way. He'll take a bad situation and make it better for those involved, and he doesn't need any of the credit. He's not looking for the glory. So in this first miracle done at Cana, at the wedding there, we see kind of his, we'll call it modus operandi. This is just the way he's going to operate. He's not trying to impress with the miracles. He does the things he does because he has compassion. He does the things he does, these miracles and healings and raising people from the dead and giving sight to the blind, because he feels bad for the people who are so afflicted, or in this case, we're going to suffer a huge social embarrassment. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. Now we're going to pop back to geography here. Notice his mother and brothers are with him at this point. In the not too distant future, his brothers aren't going to want to have anything to do with him, but they all come back around. But he's here in Cana, and he's going north. He's going east by northeast over to Capernaum, but it says he's going down. And it has nothing to do with geography as you think of it. We talk about going up north, going down south, going out west, going back east, right? Everything revolved around Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's way down here. We're going to switch maps in just a minute with where it's talking about us going. We'll go ahead and do that now. Jerusalem, see the cursor? See my little finger? Way down here. They're way up here. That's 80 miles. When it says they went up to Jerusalem, it says they went up. They're going south. Jerusalem was the center of their world. You went up to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem, it was down to everywhere else. And if you were moving in the direction away from Jerusalem, they would always call it down. But some of these distances, it was an 80-mile hike from Capernaum down to Jerusalem. Kind of interesting. I've never done an 80-mile hike. I'm sure there are people out there in the military who have done things like that. For most of us, it's hard to imagine. So Jesus cleansing the temple. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. We just talked about the up part, and it is important, their worldview, how they assessed things. And the other component with that I don't think I mentioned, the other item to consider, Jerusalem was also the top of the world. Now, they knew there were mountains that were taller. Mount Bashan, just north of where Jesus was there in Capernaum, up in Caesarea Philippi, where he was going to have his transfiguration, etc. It was much taller than Mount Zion, on which Jerusalem was built. That wasn't the point. It was the top of the world because that's where Yahweh had his home, where Yahweh had his temple that abode with the people. Well, let's talk about the Passover of the Jews. We mentioned this before. There are in John, and I'm going to pop this little thing here, and it's going to show John 6:4. It says, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. 11:55, the beginning of Holy Week, that time. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem. 3 Passovers. This one in John 2, and then the other two. The other two were the ones referenced in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John fills in details. Again, he's soaring over the other 3, and he's looking down, and the Holy Spirit saying, fill in that blank, fill in that blank. This needs to be here. That needs to be here. There are miracles in John that aren't anywhere else. There are things in John that aren't anywhere else. All of the I ams. I am the bread of life. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. There are 7 I am statements. They're all in the Gospel of John. We wouldn't have had any of them without the Gospel of John. But he went up to Jerusalem, and he went to, we're going to look at this graphic here first before we talk about what happens here. This temple of Herod, and there are some movies when they show the temple, and they do a fairly good job of showing its magnificence because they can do it with CGI stuff and all of that. Herod's temple was huge. It was gorgeous. It had been being built, and we're going to see it in the text today, for 46 years. It was mostly done by this point in time, but it had been in the works for a long time, and it was only going to last. We are here at about 28 AD, probably 27, 28 AD. 70 AD, the Romans were going to come and they were going to destroy it. Next to it, for comparison here, we've got Solomon's temple, which was beautiful. It was destroyed by the Babylonians. And when they built another temple to replace it, they wept and cried, those who remembered Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple was beautiful. It was gorgeous. Herod's temple was just a colossus. Size-wise, that's Solomon's temple here, the floor plan. This is Herod's temple. And that's an American football field. Just to put it in perspective, how huge, how massive this compound was. And they were proud of it. Rightly so. It was magnificent. Okay? That's where this went down. And you had all of those courts and the space. Pop it back up here. You had all these courts and area, and look here, do you see the columns? That's called Solomon's Colonnade, this gorgeous area for people to go and spend time and be there, okay? And there were different gates going into it. Jesus wasn't happy with what he found. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and money changers sitting there, and making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. In the last section on the wedding at Cana, we saw Christ's divinity and his humanity, his care, his concern, and not that that's separated from his divinity. It certainly is not. But here, we saw his divinity shine in compassion. Here we see zeal. We see passion. We see anger. This made him angry that he went into the temple. And you think of what the temple was about. This grand, glorious structure, whether it was, let's see, I need to move myself. Whether it was Herod's temple or Solomon's temple, this structure was made to represent Eden. It was decorated with these motifs of trees and fruits and all this different stuff. It was God's dwelling place with man. This temple is where God's presence on earth was. It's where he met his people. That's where the Day of Atonement, Passover, all these different things. This is the center for all of that. And they had turned it into a bazaar, a flea market. And it was about the money. Faithful Jews, every male was expected to attend certain festivals, and so they would come. The city was packed. Think of a city where the Super Bowl's being held. I grew up outside of Indianapolis, the Indianapolis 500. You have 300,000 people come to town. Guess what? It gets really crowded. That was the kind of thing that was going on at the time of the Passover, but those people came and they needed animals to have sacrificed. They needed to change their money because there was only certain money that could be used in the temple. So concessions were sold to these individuals. The temple, translate the Sadducees and the Pharisees, but especially the Sadducees, got a cut of all of this. Kind of sounds like our politics today, doesn't it? Who gets the job building the great big freeway interchange? You can bet they're connected to the governor, right? same kind of thing. But it was all about the money. The thing that really upset him was that it was supposed to be a holy place. It was supposed to be for the worship of God. And they were using it, that beautiful place that I just showed you, they were using it for a market. And that stuff had nothing to do with the purpose of the temple. And there is always this theme in the scriptures, whether you look at John the Baptist, who went away from, had nothing to do with all the wealth and comfort of this world. And here we see Jesus taking the economic, the financial, the wealth component and driving it out. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. The Father doesn't want to have anything to do with it because it was about greed. It was about profit. If it was done outside and done legitimately and not gouging people, do you think these guys were gouging people? You ever gone to the Indianapolis 500 and bought a snow cone? You have to take out a mortgage, right? Same thing with the Super Bowl, just to get a room. Same kind of thing going on. But he makes a whip of cords. This is the only gospel that tells us that he made a whip of cords. He made a whip of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. It's interesting. He drove out the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Can you imagine the chaos that ensued? Whose money was whose? How were they going to sort that out? Whose animals were whose? They were all driven out en masse. And can you imagine what just a disaster and debacle this made of the temple? Not what Jesus was doing here, but just this trade going on. I don't know if you've ever been to a cattle auction, but imagine it in the temple. And he told those who sold the pigeons, take these things away. He didn't want to hurt the pigeons. They were probably in little cages and things. He wasn't going to bust the cages open and set the pigeons free. He might have hurt the pigeons. I almost said penguins. He might have hurt them. So he just told them, take these things away. But the message, my Father's house, do not make my Father's house a house of trade. He was passionate about this. And his disciples remembered this from Psalm 69, zeal for your house will consume me. And go read Psalm 69 and see all that is there in Psalm 69. It's a Psalm of David. All that is there that the disciples still didn't understand. But this part, because it talks about his suffering and other things in there, but this part, zeal for your house will consume me, they were familiar with and they recognized that because they knew he was the Messiah. He was the Christ. So then that we've got this exchange where the Jews say to him, what sign do you do to show us that you can do these things? Jesus never once responds to a demand for a sign in a positive way. He never gives them the sign that they ask for. He will give them a sign that they didn't ask for, and they never understand the sign. The promise, the prophecy in Isaiah 7:14 that he would be born of a virgin was given to a king who said, oh, no, I won't. God had told him, ask for a sign. And he said, oh, no, I'm not going to. And he wasn't a faithful king. And God gives him a sign about the virgin birth. Virgin will be with child, etc. Here, they ask for a sign. Jesus, when they demand a sign, never gives them a sign. He's not going to answer to them. He's not going to play by their rules, and that will come up again, and we'll talk about it more then. But he said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And we've got the confusion that they think he's talking about the building, because with them, it was always about the building. It always goes back to the edifice itself, because that building, and this happens in churches, the building, its beauty, its magnificence, oh, that it's well taken care of and preserved. It is a proclamation of their power, of their position, of their wealth. It's all tied up with all of that. So they will always fixate on the temple. But he wasn't talking about that temple. He was talking about the temple of his body. And it says, go back down here toward the end, that his disciples, after he was raised from the dead, they remembered that he had said that, destroy this temple. And there's so much here to cover. And that statement, destroy this temple, when he's on trial, Matthew 26, they found 2 false witnesses that said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. But even then, they couldn't agree on it, we're told. So 3 years later, they're still referring to this statement about the temple, because they're always fixated on the temple. We'll move on. Verse 23, now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. This few little verses here, 2 verses. Keep it in mind when we get to John 6, 7, 8, and the Jews are turning on him and arguing with him and attacking him. And I'm blanking out on the reference right now from the Psalms. Do not put your trust in princes and mortal men who cannot save. In this life, in this world full of sinners like you and me, but everyone else is a sinner, don't think that they're going to be there for you. Don't think that those who sing your praises today will not, if it suits them and saves their hide, will kick you in the back and throw you to the wolves a week later if it suits them. Many of you, many of us have had such things happen with work. We might have had such things happen with family. Might have even had things happen within the operation and in the politics and things that go on in the church. They'll love you one day and stab you in the back the next. And I'm not saying be cynical, but what does it say? Many believed in him, but he did not entrust himself to them. What they thought of him, he didn't let it affect him. He wasn't there to impress them. He was there to save them. He was there to be faithful. He was there to be faithful to his Father. So the way we look at the praise or the rejection that comes from others, the hypocrisy, the two-faced, forked tongue, whatever things that might happen to us, we keep it in perspective by remembering that we don't answer to them, we answer to our Heavenly Father. And in that there is comfort. I'm not going to feel good about myself because what others may say, or feel bad about myself because what they don't say, or perhaps what they do say. I'm going to keep my eyes on my Savior. I'm going to seek to be faithful to Him. And beyond that, I don't have any control. I don't have any control. I'll let all that play out as it might. Okay, we did it. Went over a few minutes from our 30 minutes, but that's all right. We got the whole chapter done. I wasn't just trying to get the whole chapter done. It's just that half the chapter wasn't enough, and we're ready to move on to some guy named Nicodemus who comes to Jesus in the night, and things get very, very interesting. I want to thank you for listening. I pray that this teaching, I pray that this ministry and what we do is a blessing to you. I invite you, hit that like button, hit that share button. If you haven't yet, subscribe. Drop by and see us at decodingthedeception.com and prayerfully consider supporting this ministry. This is Matthias 76. Together, we are decoding the deception. God bless and have a great day.